Before I start this video, I just want to say something about Ravi. When I heard the news of his death, I was working and I just went to the bathroom and just cried because he has completely transformed my life. He's the whole reason that I created this YouTube channel, to provide an answer, to give evidence for Christianity. So, to family and friends, many mourn beside you, and we're all praying together. These videos, you go find them on Ravi Zacharias ministry. I put the link in the description. He was such an amazing speaker and evangelist, and he's transformed hundreds and thousands of people, hearts and their minds. And though we mourn right now, we also rejoice because now he's with the Lord, and we have hope that one day, when it's our time, we will see him. Enjoy.
Hear me?
Yes, sir.
Let's leave aside Christianity and historical examples for a second. All night you guys have been grappling with issues like morality and, what is right, what is wrong, and meaning. But my question is simply, why are you so afraid of subjective moral reasoning? I mean, do you think that we're all just going to start raping and pillaging just because we don't have a book to tell us what to do? I mean, are you afraid of that? Like, I'm not, because that's not going to happen. And that, yeah, Nazis were bad, but there were Christian Nazis and there were atheist Nazis. So I don't see, what are you so afraid of?
Do you lock your door at night?
Yeah. Sure.
I hear what you're saying. Sounds very cavalier, though. My goodness. If we weren't afraid of all of this, we would not be in a national debt. The billions.
China is secular.
Sorry?
China is secular.
Sorry?
China is secular.
That's right. What does that
I
mean?
mean, they're not raping and pillaging, and neither are we.
Oh my, oh my, oh my, oh my. Oh my. Have you read what happened during the Red Guards Rebellion? Have you read what happened during the Boxer Rebellion? Do you know who has killed more people in the 20th century than China and Russia? 60 million apiece? Wow. It makes the Holocaust seem tame. The 20th century became the bloodiest century in history. And the reason it became the bloodiest century in history, I can see, is you could just see the weapons of our warfare were piling up, and there was no guiding principle to take us anywhere. Now, in a perfect world, yes, we don't need to be afraid. Have you seen what happens in our courts of law, where people supposedly love each other, and all that comes about in hate and vitriol and damage? I don't think the question is fairly stated as what are you afraid of? I'm just saying it is basically unlivable. I didn't conclude that. An atheist like Jean-Paul Sartre concluded it. We killed more people in the 20th century than the previous 19 put together. And your question is, what are we afraid of? The fact of the matter is, if morality is purely subjective, then you have absolutely nothing from stopping anybody for being a subjective moralist to choose to just zing one through your forehead and say, that's my answer. How do you stop that? Obviously, you don't believe that's the way it should be. No, neither do I. So it's not a case of what am I afraid of. It's a case of the fact that if you're willing to say to me that moral reasoning can be purely subjective, I just say to you, look out, you ain't seen nothing yet if everybody believed what you did. Do you know, funny, interesting, when I was in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, Stalin eliminated 15 million of his own people. 15 million of his own people. And at the Center for Geopolitical Strategy, they didn't want to even name his name and so on. His daughter, Svetlana, made the comment. It is quoted both by Malcolm Muggeridge in his writings and by historian Paul Johnston in Modern Times. Svetlana was standing by the bedside of her father before he died. She said the last thing he did was clench his fist toward the heavens one more time, put his head back on the pillow, and he was gone. This is his daughter raising the question, whatever got into my father to have that kind of hatred and hostility? And when 15 million were killed of his own people, it is interesting that the faculty members and the general who chatted with me there, my wife will tell you, sat around the table with tears in his eyes when he watched what had been done to his own country by his own leadership. So subjective morality would be very good if we all wanted to be nice people and live around each other without any fear of each other. But the reason you lock your doors, and the reason we have our police, and the reason we have our military, and the reason we have our law courts is because when subjective morality becomes totally subjectivized, this is what happens in society. So it's a great idea, but I hope nobody absorbs it. Thank you. We go on to the next one there. Thank you.
Story is told of a lawyer and a doctor and an architect who were arguing as to whose was the oldest profession. And the doctor said, it has to be mine, because when God formed Eve out of the side of Adam, somebody had to sew him back. So the doctor said, my trade was called into being used. And the architect said, wait a minute. Before that, God framed the universe out of chaos. So the framing of the universe was the architect's job. And the lawyer is sitting there laughing, saying, who do you think created the chaos in the first place? So you've got a man who's giving clarity in chaos and a man who's giving you answers without any billing. He's a
story of that. I think you said he was Jewish and he was shot by at that. I think it was a concentration camp or something like that. And I'm going to play the devil's advocate for a bit and pretend I'm Sam Harris. No pun intended, of course. You stated that God was watching. God watched the gentleman pull the trigger. If God was watching, why didn't he make that trigger not work? Why didn't he make that poor individual just pass out while he was digging the grave? Okay. I believe Sam Harris would ask that type of question and demand an answer.
Yes, I appreciate that question. Playing the devil's advocate, you said that why didn't God keep the man from pulling the trigger rather than allowing the man to pull the trigger and then watch over him and bringing about some kind of judgment? I would say this to you, that the supreme ethic that God has given to us is the ethic of love. It is the peak of all intellectual and emotional alignment. This thing we call love, which places value upon the other person of worth and as something to be protected. It was interesting, of all people, it was Oscar Wilde who on his deathbed in his 40s by his lover by his side, Robbie Ross, he turned to Robbie and he said, "Did you love any one of those little boys for their own sake?" It was an incredible question to ask by a man who was a hedonist on his deathbed in his 40s. And he said, "Robbie, did you ever love any one of those little boys for their own sake?" And Robbie Ross said, "No, I can't say I did." He said, "Bring me a minister. Bring me a minister." And it was in his magnificent poem, The Ballad of Reading Gaol, that Oscar Wilde said, "Only Christ was big enough to cleanse his heart and forgive him for all that he had done." The point even the hedonist realized was that in pleasure also, value and love are the supreme ethics that can be treasured. But you can never have love without intrinsically weaving into it the freedom of the will. You cannot have love without the freedom of the will. If you are compelled by some machine to a certain decision, you can never love. You can comply, but you will never be choosing to express that sentiment and the reality of love. If love is the supreme ethic, and freedom is indispensable to love, and God's supreme goal for you and for me is that we will love him with all of our hearts and love our neighbors as ourselves, for him to violate our free will would be to violate that which is a necessary component so that love can flourish and love can be expressed. If you're asking for God to always stop the trigger, why not God stop everything else? Next time you hold a cup of boiling water, he makes it frozen water instead. Next time you're about to cross the street and you're going to be hit, he pulls your leg back. What you're asking for is a different entity than humanity. As wonderful as it may seem that in stopping that you think he is protecting you from that which is destructive, the greatest denial that you're asking for is the freedom of your will to be able to choose and to love God with all your heart and all your soul. When you've got love as the supreme ethic and the freedom of the will to choose that love, all of the other contingencies come in and can become explained why it is possible to either choose or to reject so that love can ultimately reign supreme. If you want compliance and some kind of a mechanical response, your question itself will self-destruct. You're asking the question because you're free to ask it, and you're free to ask it because you're free to love. And when you love him, in spite of all of the contraries that you see around us, you're trusting him for having the supreme wisdom and the knowledge to ultimately bring a pattern out of it all. We think, for example, we know so much. The story is told in Mideastern folklore of this man who lost his horse that ran away. And when the horse ran away, the neighbor came to him and said, "You know, bad luck, isn't it? Your horse is gone." He said, "What do I know about these things?" A few days later, the horse came back with 20 other wild horses. And the neighbor came and said, "Amazing, it's not bad luck, it's good luck. You've got 20 more." Man says, "What do I know about these things?" His young son is going and taming one of the new horses. That young horse kicks him and breaks his leg. The neighbor comes and says, "Terrible, isn't it? Your son's leg is broken. Bad luck that these horses came." The fellow says, "What do I know about good luck and bad luck?" A few days go by and a bunch of thugs are coming looking for recruits to join their gang, and they're looking for all the able-bodied young men, and they're about to pick this young man but find out his leg is broken, and they say, "We don't want him, we're going to move on to the next house." So the man comes and says, "Good luck, isn't it? Your son's leg was broken." In one little series of episodes, we don't know what lies ahead. Why don't you wait till you stand before God face to face, and you will find out there were reasons why he didn't stop that trigger, so that you will see the heinousness of evil and see the majesty of love and good managing to navigate yourself but as a pilgrim's progress to come to the celestial city. You know, in India, when I was growing up, India produces more movies than any other nation on the face of the earth. And some of those movies, when you see them, you know why they produce more movies than any other nation on the face of the earth. When I was growing up, there was no kissing on the Indian screen. All right?
the fellow would generally be chasing her around trees and singing a song. And as soon as he catches up with her, the scene would change. So I remember somebody writing to an Indian comedian and saying, what's the difference between love on the Western screen and love on the Indian screen? He said just one word, trees. They just ran around all these trees. But you know, the funny thing, the entire structure of my culture in which I was raised was not based on romantic marriages, it was based on arranged marriages. I had people in my family who arrived at the wedding day without even knowing what the other person looked like. Horrors. Think of that. What are you in for? You don't even know what this person looks like.
Hi. I guess for me, my hardest problem with Christianity is reconciling, I guess, love. Because how do we reconcile, like, can Christians be homosexual? Can homosexuality fit into a Christian lifestyle? Because I know I look at friends or family who are homosexual, and I see love, and I know homosexual. Can homosexuality... Hi. I guess for me, my hardest problem with Christianity is reconciling, I guess, love. Because how do we reconcile, like, can Christians be homosexual? Can homosexuality fit into a Christian lifestyle? Because I know I look at friends or family who are homosexual, and I see love, and I know it's said in the Bible, but I'm sorry if my question's convoluted, but I was wondering what your opinion was on that.
I can be candid with you. This question follows us almost everywhere we go. My team members and I sit down and we talk about it, because the situation you've given is precisely the situation all of us experiences one way or the other with family or friends and so on. So as volatile a subject as it is, and as thorny an issue as it is, please give me a few moments to explain why I see the problem is the way it is. To be honest with you, I talk with my friends and I say, this is such a critical issue that I wish sometimes we could just sit around a table and talk about it, rather than in public forums where people take one word or one line or one innuendo and make it to mean what you never intended to say or mean at all. And the consequences are huge, as you can imagine, for people like us who are in the public arena, in countries and universities like UPenn here. I know there's been buzz and all, but I'm honored that you guys give me the opportunity to come here. I'm in the sunset years of my life. I've done this for 40 years. I'm not looking for any more invitations. I'm happy to sit back and write. I think I've done my bit now. But I'm honored to be here. And when you raise a question like this, please let me give you a sociological background. I know people don't like long answers, but anybody who gives short answers to such profound questions obviously hasn't thought it through. There are three types of cultures in my studies. The first kind of culture is called a theonomous culture. Theos, God, nomos, law. Okay? The law of God. Once upon a time in the West, we would call that, rather subtly, we would call it natural law, that these truths are self-evident. That was a hint at natural law. There are no theonomous cultures left as far as I know. The closest that comes to a theonomous culture, I think, would be India. They call themselves Dharti ke Admi, people of the soil. And the imperatives of the heart are aligned with the commands of God. That's the way Hinduism has generally functioned. Reverence for the elders, for family, and all of that. Hinduism has sort of almost operated in a visceral way, believing this is all part of your inside. That's a theonomous culture. Then there is a heteronomous culture. Heteros meaning another, nomos meaning law. That there is another law at work. There are heteronomous cultures today. Iran is a heteronomous culture. It is the domination of the masses by a handful of leaders. I've talked to Iranian young people who say if they ever had the opportunity to throw this off their necks, they would. But it is a demagogic, controlling culture. In political secularism, China is a heteronymous culture where the few at the top control it for the masses below. So theonomous is God's law is in your heart. Heteronymous is where another force dictates for you from above. Both in religion and politics, I believe it's a dangerous game to play. So the last is an autonomous culture. Autos meaning self, nomos meaning law, where you are a law unto yourself. Every audience I've spoken to in North America or in the West, if I ask them what kind of culture of the three are we, they will tell us we're an autonomous culture. We have a law that governs our own lives. Then I say to them, if I disagree with somebody on a certain question and what my position is different from the other person's, will I be given the privilege of autonomy, or will they suddenly switch to heteronomy and enforce their view on me? So how do you discuss autonomous freedom when heteronomy comes in a bait and switch? And this is exactly what has happened today. If tolerance is real, then we need to respect each other's right to believe what we do in these things without violating that right. Why is it that even to hold to a position is deemed unacceptable? To the Christian, life and marriage are sacred, and so we operate under that premise. But if a person comes to me and says, I do not hold to that view, this is my privilege and my prerogative to live the way I want, believe it or not, I will give that person a hug and say, you operate with the freedom you have, I operate with the freedom I have. We all stand before God someday. I am not your judge. God is the ultimate judge for you and me. I love people with whom I deeply disagree, and so I would say to you, do what you are doing in your conscience with the sacredness of life. And if you do it with the desacralization of life, that is still your prerogative, and hope people can live with this disagreement and not enforce one view over the other. I have very close friends of differing views on this, and I still consider them close friends on this matter. God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Many years ago, I just arrived from a long trip. I'm pretty sure it was Bangkok to New York. It was one of those long hauls, and the good thing about that is that you look like your passport picture when you get off the plane. So I'd gotten off and I was looking for my departure gate, and it was there. I found the gate, but on the marquee it showed a different city. So I looked at the lady sitting in the corner. I said, is the flight from here going where I think it's supposed to go to Atlanta, or is it going where the marquee is saying it's headed? She said, no, it's going to Atlanta. I said, good. So I turned around to go and get myself a cup of coffee, and I heard the sound of feet behind me, hastily following, and a tap on the shoulder, and it was this lady. And she looked at me and she said, excuse me, are you Ravi Zacharias? I said, I'm afraid so. That's who I am. She said, that is amazing. It is absolutely amazing. I didn't know you had questions as well. I'm not making up this story. Even though I was a little groggy from that long flight, I didn't know you had questions as well.
There is nothing in the Bible that intimates the chance after death. There's a passage in Peter to which people sometimes refer, and one particular sect believes that. What I have found is that wherever I have gone, I am amazed at how God has been able to reach people in places that I never even thought his voice would have been heard or the gospel would ever have been preached. I don't know if you've ever read the story of Sammy Morris from Africa. It's called The March of Faith. How he came out of that tiny little village and somehow was a stowaway on a ship, arrived in New York, and went looking for somebody who could open up life for him. And when Samuel Merritt gave him the gospel, he said, that's the one I've been looking for. That's the name I never had, but that's the Savior I have always wanted. And in fact, Taylor University, where he went and attended,
has the chapel named after Samuel Morris. I think you and I need to bear in mind that God, who is omniscient and omnipotent, has a way of reaching people way beyond what you and I may actually imagine. Let me give you my own personal illustration. I had never cracked open a Bible on my own in my life. And when I lay on a hospital bed there, the last thing I really expected was a Bible to be brought to me. And yet, this individual comes in to my hospital room, gives me that Bible. I couldn't hold it because my body was totally dehydrated with the poison that I'd taken and all the moisture that I'd thrown out of my system. I couldn't hold it, so he gives it to my mother. My mother, reading in the King James language, didn't do very well, but she was reading through it in John chapter 14. And I had to ask myself, how did this happen? That I, as a total destitute, am lying in a hospital bed and this man comes in with a Bible to give me the scriptures to read. This man ended up, he's an Indian man, ended up living in California, and he passed away in February of this year. And I spoke to him a few weeks before he died. I phoned him, he was living in a lot of pain. And he said this to me on the phone. I quoted it at Princeton that night, and I didn't know his daughter was listening in on the phone. And she asked if she could put it as one of his eulogies on the website because he just passed away the week before. He said, Ravi, I sometimes wonder if I came into this world just in order to be able to come and bring this Bible to you in the situation in which you were. You know, I started crying on the phone, and I said to him, I said, you know, Fred, God had a lot more for you in life than just that. He found it totally fulfilling that whatever prompting he had in his heart to bring the scriptures to a desperate young man at 17 and give him the verse from John chapter 14 where Jesus said, because I live, you also shall live. God has amazing ways of reaching people in places that you and I would never, ever dream about. Let me give you one more illustration of this, and I'll be seated, and after that. My brother-in-law, Sundar Krishnan, came from an Orthodox Brahmin Hindu family. We grew up together. I've always said, I thought for a lot of time that he liked me, found out he liked my sister. He's my brother-in-law now. He was a nuclear physicist for the Atomic Energy of Canada, gave that up. In the peak of his career as a chief safety expert, went into Christian ministry. His father and mother, quite orthodox in their beliefs, and they would talk to them, I would talk to them, they would sit listening. And the father was a very, very sophisticated thinker and a very moral man. He never said much. He would read C.S. Lewis, he would take me into a side room and ask me some questions. Sometimes he didn't want to do it openly. At the age of 85, he died. It was on Thanksgiving weekend, Canadian Thanksgiving. And he was lying in bed there, and my sister told me, we walked into the hospital with my children and all of the relatives, and he's lying there in bed, and he said, I want to say something to all of you. You know the kind of life I've led. You know the manner of truth I have pursued. You know who I am. I've done my best never to cheat anybody, never to defraud anybody. But he said, I'm dying now, and I know my end is near. So I want to answer the question I have pursued all my life. What is the way to God? And my sister said, Rav, we were standing around the bed there, and I wondered what he was going to say. With our grandkids and all of his friends standing. He said, I have come to the conclusion, lying on my hospital bed here, all alone and seeking for answers, that the answer is in Jesus Christ. He said, that's my Savior, that's my Lord, and I leave him with all of you before I depart. Nobody talking to him in that hospital room. Nobody sharing anything with him. So you know what the Bible says, shall not the judge of all the earth do that which is right? You can be absolutely confident that God will do what is right, what is pure, what is loving, and what is just. Nabil said this, and I think it was Jürgen Moltmann who quoted Elie Wiesel. Standing in concentration camp, Elie Wiesel saw a young man struggling as he was being hanged, struggling for life. And he said, I kept asking, where are you, God? Where are you? And he said, out of nowhere, the voice came into my mind, and I can't figure out why. The voice came saying, hanging there on the gallows, where else? This Christ, who gave himself for you and for me, will go to the trouble of revealing himself to all the ends of the earth. And the Bible makes that very clear, even in the book of Romans. Worry about what you know and what you must share to the other part of the world. God will do that which is right, as he's given us the opportunity and time. It's interesting that you began by saying, as an atheist, all of this has been disproved, and so you live with scientific materialism as your worldview. I studied under John Polkinghorne at Cambridge University. You probably know the name. One of the world's leading quantum physicists, who came to exactly the opposite conclusion you did while being the dean at Queen's College, Cambridge, as a quantum physicist, taking the same data you did. So obviously, for a man of his intellectual ability to come to a different conclusion, one would either have to say he's totally stupid to come to that conclusion, or else his empirical basis. Please don't keep shaking your head. Let me finish so that you can come and talk afterwards. So allow us to concentrate what we are saying here. I want to read for you what David Berlinski says about the scientific naturalistic worldview. Do you know who he is? No. One of the world's leading physicists who is an agnostic, borders on atheism, but took issue with Richard Dawkins's book, The God Delusion, and wrote a book called The Devil's Delusion. Here's what he said. Has anyone ever provided proof of God's inexistence? Not even close. Has quantum cosmology explained the emergence of the universe or why it is here? Not even close. Have the sciences explained why our universe seems to be fine-tuned to allow for the existence of life? Not even close. This is Berlinski talking. Are physicists and biologists willing to believe in anything as long as it is not religious thought? Close enough. Has rationalism and moral thought provided us with an understanding of what is good, what is right, and what is moral? Not close enough. Has secularism in the terrible 20th century been a force for good? Not even close to being close. Is there a narrow and oppressive orthodoxy of thought and opinion within the sciences? Close enough. Does anything in the sciences or in their philosophy justify the claim that religious belief is irrational? Not even in the ballpark. Is scientific atheism a frivolous exercise in intellectual contempt? Dead on. Now, I didn't say that, all right? I'm not quoting myself. Please give me your name, sir. Ethan. Ethan? Yes. Ethan, what you're wrestling with is not uncommon. Many people from a scientific and materialistic worldview will say what you've said and come to that conclusion. The problem is what you mispositioned was your concern between determinism and free will. Your application could have gone in many different directions, but you came to that one for some reason, which I was unfortunate, I think. At Cambridge, I listened to a talk at the Lady Mitchell Hall in 1990 by Stephen Hawking. As you know, he can't speak. He uses a speech synthesizer. His whole talk was on determinism and freedom. And you know what he concluded? That the tragedy with scientific materialism, if we take its assumptions, is that we are not free, we are totally determined. That was the world's leading physicist at that time saying, the very thing you're asking of the Christian faith, he pinned on your backs as scientific materialists. You can go right online and trace it. Lady Mitchell Hall, 1990, somewhere on March, April, May, that time I was in attendance. And he said, the only escape I have is since I don't know what has been determined, I may as well not be. The whole auditorium moaned and groaned with an escape hatch that he gave for himself after telling us that we were completely determined. That's Berlinski's issue. That is actually even what people like Dawkins will concede, or Pinker. You read Steven Pinker and the others. So totally determined. So the question is, were you free to ask this question? Yep.
I don't believe any of us actually have free will because we are strictly material.
So you're actually, as a machine automaton, asking me this question?
We are all made up of our past experiences.
Okay, but you're not free then. You're not free. You're not making a truth statement.
My truth statement. I mean, what I'm saying is our memories and our states.
No, hear me carefully.
Okay.
If you're totally determined,
yes,
you're pre-wired to think the way you do.
Nature versus nurture, yes.
Sorry?
Nature versus nurture.
Nature versus nurture.
Yes.
regardless. The nurture may provide a different environment, but the nature is you're hardwired to come out with a certain conclusion. Out of flux, nothing but flux. You know, what you put into the computer, ultimately is going to come out. But you have to ask yourself, are you making a truth claim? If you are making a truth claim, you're rising above the bondage of total subjectivity. And the moment you claim a truth claim, you're violating determinism. And so I just leave you with that. And let's meet afterwards. Hey, Ethan, we want to chat with you. You know, you're the kind of guy we come here for. So afterwards, you come here and we'll chat with you. Come here, give me a shake hand. Bless you, brother. Thanks, buddy. Thank you. That was the one thing the Greeks searched for, which they never found. How do you find unity in diversity? How do you find unity in diversity? You know what their answer was? Create the universities. That's where we get the word.
You say that heartless, egregious acts like the Holocaust are brought about by people without a moral reference point in God. But how do you explain all the death and destruction that has been done in a God's name, such as the Crusades, the Inquisition, suicide bombings, or Christianizing the quote-unquote savage?
Yeah. Great question. And I appreciate you asking that. The base of the question doesn't change, that whatever was done by A or B were both dastardly things. They ought not to have been done. That's the assumption we both make here, whether it was done in the name of atheism or whether it was done in the name of religion. People often say that religion has been so divisive, religion has been so horrible and so much of evil in this world, and it has its share to face. But let me just say that you go back across history, and when Nietzsche penned his madman parable, he made this comment. He said, if God is dead in this 19th century, philosophically, the 20th century will become the bloodiest century in history. And he said a universal madness will break out. And in the 20th century, we killed more people in warfare than all of the previous 19 centuries put together. All right? Now, and Nietzsche, ironically, took the first step himself. The last 13 years of his life, he spent insane, just in a world of his own, and every now and then quoting the scripture when he broke his silence. If you take statistically what happened under Mao, what happened under Stalin, what happened under Pol Pot, the 130 to 150 million killed just between these three, it pales any other tragedy of any other worldview that has been committed, religious or otherwise, across the centuries. So first of all, the numbers game is not what atheists sometimes make it out to be. The numbers are huge. I'm going to be in Shanghai within a couple of weeks. I'll be there 3 weeks from now. And I remember being in Nanjing, where I saw the seminary that Mao Zedong had burned, and talked to them on the 60-some million that he killed. When he burned the seminary, he said, God is going to be evicted from this land, never to be brought back here again. The fastest growing church in the world today is in China. It's absolutely amazing. It's the fastest growing church in the world today, somewhere between 50 to 100 million. When Crusades and all took place, the religious people calling themselves Christians made the biggest blunder you ever make with your faith in God, and that's the politicization of religion. That became a state church, a politicized church, as some of it still is, and that's why in Europe today, where you see the state church, you see the resistance towards that kind of teaching. It was kind of setting up a theocracy when it was actually more a theonomy, where enforcing the laws of God on people supposedly, but the hierarchy was in the hands of men. When you look at the Christian worldview in quotes that did this, you knew they were violating the fundamentals of their very Christian faith. So it was a deviation from what they claimed to believe. When you see violence in the atheistic worldview, it's very much in keeping with the assumptions that we are pragmatically going to be our own God and make our own destiny. So you never ever judge a philosophy by its abuse. Never ever judge a philosophy by its abuse. You take a look at the philosophy in its logical outworkings. Now, this is where I sometimes have discussions with my Muslim friends on this issue of suicide bombing and what's happening in parts of the Middle East today, in the warfare that's going on. That is, of course, a completely different religious worldview to what the Christian faith is all about. We must understand this. All religions don't believe the same things. You well know, probably come from the same part of the world as I do, that you know how different these assumptions are. So I may give you a conversation that I had with Sheikh Talal, who was one of the founders of Hamas. The Archbishop of Canterbury took me and 4 other men to meet with the leaders on both sides of all the conflict that was going on. And we were Sheikh Talal as one of the founders of Hamas. We'd met with all of the leaders, one after another. It was a tough, tough week. My mind was exhausted by the time I'd finished listening to both sides on this. Last day we were in Ramallah. And Sheikh Talal has hosted us for a big meal, and Yasser Arafat's men, and all of them in the room, smoke-filled room, big meal. It's over. The Archbishop was the lead man, so he carried on the conversation. Then he looked at the 5 of us. He said, I give you men each a chance to ask one question. I won't tell you what question I asked Sheikh Talal, but it is along the vein that you've just raised. That's all I'll say to you. And I didn't like his answer. I didn't like it. He's a big guy. He could have eaten me without salt and pepper, you know. And I looked at him and I said, Sheikh, I don't like your answer. I have to say this to you. I said, but Sheikh, I want to say something to you because you and I may never see each other again. I said, not far from here is a mountain. 5,000 years ago, a man you and I respect, Abraham, went up that mountain to express his faith in God, and to do that, he was offering his own son. He said, that's right. I said, let's not argue which son it was, or we'll get into a different argument here. I said, let's agree it was his son. He said, okay. I said, when he went up and that proverbial axe is about to fall, God stopped that arm. He said, that's right. I said, do you know what God said? He said, no. I said, God said, stop. I myself will provide. He said, yeah, that's right. I said, Sheikh, very close to where you and I are sitting is a hill called Calvary. 2,000 years ago, God kept that promise. He took his own son up that hill. I said, Sheikh, this time the arm did not stop. I said, until you and I receive the Son that God has provided for us, we'll be offering our own sons and daughters on the battlefields of this world for position, power, land, and prestige. There was a pin drop silence in the room. The Archbishop said, I guess it's time to go. So walking away, I walked towards the staircase. I thought, brother, I've blown it big time. The Archbishop came and put his arm around me and he said, Ravi, thank you. He said, that was of God. I said, I sure hope so. I'd never thought of that until just now. So we go down the steps, and the Archbishop being the guest of honor, the Sheikh went but he quickly hurried him into his car and ran towards where I was. I thought, that's it, finished. I'm going to be buried in Ramallah. He came over to me and he grabbed me by the shoulders. As you know, some of you may know, I have a back problem. Got 2 metal rods after 2 major operations. He grabbed me by the shoulder and he looked me eyeball to eyeball. And he patted me on the face and kissed me on both sides of my face. He said, Mr. Zacharias, you're a good man. I hope I'll see you again someday. And I saw him wipe a tear away as he hugged me and helped me into my car. You know what? Jesus looked at his disciples when they tried to protect him with a sword. And he said, put that away. And he healed the man in his ear. He said to Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world, or my servants would fight to protect my arrest. My kingdom is from another place. Those in religion who have turned to abuse of violence in order to dominate the world have violated what Christ himself taught us. And I say to you, take a look at Jesus and not at Christendom, and ask yourself the question, what do I find wrong with him? Okay, take care. Yeah.
You mentioned that you have no problem with doubt now, but it struck me that during your entire talk, you gave reasons for belief which were instrumental in the sense that this is the good things that would happen if you believe. And I did not hear any reasons for believing that this is true. And I think there's a big difference between reasons to believe a truth versus reasons to believe that good things might come if you believe this, whether or not it's true. And along the same lines, it also struck me that you passed over what I would consider to be the strongest evidence that there is no God, which is evil. If I would see a death camp, rather than think that that's a reason to believe in God, I would think that's a reason not to believe in God. And I'd appreciate your response.
I appreciate your candor very, very much. And yes, I think that's probably, it's oftentimes they say virtue in distress and vice in triumph has made atheists of mankind, that you see this kind of evil and this kind of suffering. But let me go back to your first comment, which was an important one, that I didn't present any reasons to believe in God. I just presented reasons why I'm not an atheist. I was trying to stay with the subject matter that is given to me. In fact, tomorrow night, you're welcome to where I'm going to be. I'm going to present my defense of Christianity. And maybe they'll tell you where that will be, and I will give you the reasons very clearly there. But for now, let me just give you maybe 2 or 3 of them that I think will enable me to at least get past the hurdle. The question you've raised is germane to one of my own arguments in the beginning. If evil is real and not a construct in our own mind, and evil is truly something to be shunned and is morally deviant, then there is no way to sustain that without a moral being who's the creator of this universe. And let me give that in 2 illustrations for you. See, when a person says there's such a thing as evil, they assume there's such a thing as good. When they assume there's such a thing as good, they're assuming there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. But when they assume there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil, they have to posit a moral lawgiver, but that's whom they're trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What becomes really of the question? So here's what I want to say to you. Out of these 4 steps, from evil to good to the moral law to the moral lawgiver, the one that you could really quibble with and say, Ravi, why do I have to come up with a moral lawgiver in order to sustain a moral law or to go to good and go to evil? And the reason is this: whenever a question of evil is raised, it is either raised by a person or about a person. It is either raised by a person or about a person, which assumes, therefore, persons have intrinsic worth. And that is not a legitimate offspring ideationally of a non-theistic universe. How does one give essential worth to a product of time plus matter plus chance? So when you assume that there is implicit worth in personhood, you're actually assuming that the person is a created being by one of intrinsic and implicit worth. Now, if you go, for example, to the pantheistic worldview, all is God, God is all, you are part of the pantheistic worldview in the cycle of birth and rebirth. If you come, for example, to the Islamic worldview and you talk about God, God is so distant that you cannot really truly make too many propositional statements about him. The distance is so great between the sovereign God and the finite human. A person came to Jesus and he said to Jesus, is it all right to pay taxes to Caesar? I've just filed my taxes 3 days ago, and I wish Jesus had answered this question differently. Because at the same time, it'd be wonderful to be both godly and rebellious, you know. But Jesus looked at him and said, do you have a coin? And the man said, yes. He said, show it to me. So Jesus took the coin and said, whose image do you see on this coin? The man said, Caesar. Jesus said, give to Caesar that which belongs to Caesar, and give to God that which belongs to God. The man ought to have had a follow-up question. The follow-up question should have been, what belongs to God? Jesus would have said to him, whose image is on you? This intrinsic worth that Jesus gives to you and me, sir, is an undeniable expression of my starting point, that my questions are valuable because at core my essence is valuable. And when I see a deviation from it, I have a legitimate reason to ask that question. The problem of evil is delegitimized in a naturalistic framework. That's why Richard Dawkins, although Peter Singer here takes issue with Richard Dawkins, but Richard Dawkins' comment is fascinating. He said, I have to come to the conclusion that there is no such thing as evil. We are merely dancing to our DNA. Dawkins is being more consistent. He says that if I assume the reality of evil, I have to posit a transcendent basis on which to measure it. So I can't afford to accept the reality of evil. So I say to you, the question of evil and moral reasoning points me to a transcendent moral lawgiver. And if I take the offer on the cross for forgiveness and grace, which is what we all desperately need, without which we won't make it, and the theory of Jesus' resurrection from the dead, the Christian worldview presents to me a coherence of intrinsic worth and the resultant way in which we live, loving God and loving our fellow human being. 613 laws were given to Moses. David reduced it to 15. Isaiah to 11. Micah to 3. When Jesus was asked which is the greatest law, he didn't reduce it to 1. He said to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength and all your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. He said on these two commandments hang all of the law and the prophets. Because of the first, the second follows. Without the first, the second doesn't follow at all. It's with its feet firmly planted in midair. So the existential ramifications of knowing God and the intrinsic worth of my neighbor and my own life gives me the defense of theism much more than atheism can defend these two very issues. So I will give you a more lengthy answer on this if you come tomorrow, but I think implicit in the not of atheism is the yes of theism, how it gives me meaning, gives me hope, gives me the recovery, and more than anything else, describes my intrinsic worth and what it means to be human. My grandson, his name is Jude. He's 7 years old now. His vocabulary is terrifying. Really is terrifying. In fact, my daughter Naomi asked him a question the other day, and he said, "This is my hypothesis." 6.5-year-old at that time starts using the word hypothesis. You better keep a dictionary in the home. When he was a little over 3, his mother lost her car keys, and she couldn't find it. She slaps her forehead and says, "I must be losing my mind." And little Jude came in front of her and said, "Mommy, whatever you do, please don't ever lose your heart, because I'm in there." It may be physical maladies that you're nurturing. It may be financial struggles. It may be your home that you're weeping over and struggle to find some positive responses in a time like this. Suffering is a real part of life. We feel it again and again and again. Prior to my first back surgery, after I injured my back, I remember the days I would sit in my car and pull over into a parking spot and put my head on the steering wheel and just cry my heart out with the agony with which I was having to live, and traveling wasn't helping me any. Pain is a terrible thing, and you take that pain into your heart, it becomes almost unbearable at that point, and life is punctuated by suffering. But I want to tell you something that no other worldview will give to you this response. I want you to listen to me very, very carefully. This is written by James Stewart of Scotland. Brilliant thought. It is a glorious phrase that our Lord led captivity captive. The very triumphs of his foes it means to use for their defeat. He compelled their dark achievements to subserve his ends, not theirs. They nailed him to the tree, not knowing that by that very act they were bringing the world to his feet. They gave him a cross, not guessing that he would make it a throne. They flung him outside the gates to die, not knowing that at that very moment they were lifting up all the gates of the universe to let the King of glory come in. They thought to root out his doctrines, not understanding that they were implanting imperishably in the hearts of men the very name they intended to destroy. They thought they had God with his back to the wall, pinned and helpless and defeated. They did not know it was God himself who had tracked them down to that point. He conquered not in spite of the dark mystery of evil, he conquered through it. He conquered not in spite of the dark mystery of evil, he conquered through it. Through the process of suffering, you realize how finite you are and how desperately you need the very presence of God to carry you through. The hymn writer Annie Johnston Flint, who was orphaned early in life and then later on had rheumatoid arthritis, lost control over internal organs, became incontinent, blind, and cancer invaded her body. Her biography is called The Making of the Beautiful. Orphaned, incontinent, arthritic, cancerous, blind. She wrote many hymns. One of them was this: He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. To added affliction he addeth his mercy. To multiplied trials his multiplied peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving has only begun. His love has no limit, his grace has no measure, his power has no boundaries known unto men, for out of his infinite riches in Jesus he giveth and giveth and giveth again. I was a student in Toronto, and I offered to go to Vietnam because America was at war then. I was living in Canada, but I wanted to go and work with the military chaplains, and I was invited to speak. I was only in my 20s. I was invited to speak mainly to the youth or to maybe some military bases and so on, and I went there. And I'll tell you what, some amazing things happened. I was 25, my interpreter was 17, total age of 42. We were flying by American helicopters, we were on motorbikes. I was single at that time, and I said, well, if anything happens, it happens, you know. And and thousands of men and women gave their lives to Jesus Christ. I want to tell you a couple of stories with which I close, because it's amazing how these things come to be. After these thousands came to know Christ, I left and bid my interpreter, his name is Hien Pham, goodbye. And I was sure we'd never meet again. We left. 17 years later, at 11 o'clock at night, I was speaking in Vancouver, British Columbia, and my phone rang in my hotel room. I picked it up, and the voice says, Brother Rafi. I said, Hien? He said, you recognize my voice? I said, you're the only one who ever said, Brother Rafi. I said, where are you? He said, in California. I said, what? I said, what are you doing there? He said, my MBA. I said, you're in California doing your MBA? He said, yeah. I said, what happened? He said, have you got a few minutes? I said, I've got lots of minutes. He said, after you left, Vietnam fell. I was among those arrested and accused of working for the CIA. I told them I never worked for the CIA. They said, oh yeah, your English is so good, you had to be working for them. He said, no. I would interpret for guest speakers and work for the Americans, but I never worked for the CIA. He said, they wouldn't believe me, they put me in prison. They said, nobody ever admits working for the CIA. So they put him in prison. He was in a prison camp. They wouldn't allow him to read anything in English, only in Vietnamese and French. Marx and Engels, Vietnamese and French. That's it. Marx and Engels, Vietnamese and French. Finally, he said, Brother Rafi, they pounded into my head that there was no God. And one day I said, okay, I'm going to live as if there is no God. He said, that day they assigned me to clean the latrines. He said, you've never seen a latrine. He said, you thought you saw horrible latrines when you were with me? He said, you've never seen anything like this. He said, you have to tie a cloth around your nose and mouth to clean it. And I had this bucket and mop, and I was cleaning it, and I looked into one bucket next to a toilet. And I was about to empty the paper, but I noticed there was one piece of paper in English. He said, I looked around, I just quickly washed it and put it into my pocket. He said, everybody went to sleep that night. I waited, took out that wet piece of paper, and with a flashlight, I looked on that piece of paper. On the right, it said Romans chapter 8. And I started to read. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God and that are called according to his purpose. What shall separate us from the love of God? Shall life or death or this, principalities or powers? He said, I started crying. I said, God, today I woke up in the morning saying I will never pray to you again, and now I'm holding in my hand one verse that I needed more than anything else, that all things can work together for good to them that love God. He said, I got on my knees and begged God for forgiveness. He said, I woke up in the morning and went to the commanding office and said, do you mind if I clean the latrines again today? He said, I picked up pages from the New Testament every day. The commander had been given a Bible. He used to tear pages out of it, use it as toilet paper, and throw it into the bin. I washed it, put it into my pocket, and had my devotions at night. He said, finally, one day, they told me they were going to release me. And I was released. I got about 51 or 52 others together, including the son or daughter of the vice president, someone. We were going to build a boat to escape, and we built a boat. Several weeks went by. One day, 4 Viet Cong came knocking on my door, Brother Rafi, and said to me, you're trying to escape, aren't you? And he said, I looked at them, plain expression, and said, no. They said, are you telling us the truth? He said, yes. You're not going to escape? No. You're telling us the truth? Yes. He said, they left. He said, I slapped my forehead and said, oh, my dear God, I've done it again. He said, I prayed a prayer that I hoped would never be answered. I said, God, forgive me, and if you want me to tell them the truth, bring them back before we escape. Hours before they were to leave, these 4 guys were back, armed to the teeth, grabbed him by the collar, rammed him against a wall. You're lying. You're trying to escape, aren't you? He said, yes, with 52 others. Are you going to kill me? They said, no, we want to go with you. He said, 4 of these Viet Cong came on the boat with us. He said, Brother Rafi, on the high seas, we were in a storm, we were to capsize, but these 4 men were the best mariners we could have wanted as skippers. They finally brought us safely to Thailand. I became a refugee there and ultimately got my papers. I'm in California now doing my MBA. We flew him to my home because he wanted me to officiate at his wedding. He'd found a beautiful young Vietnamese gal he was going to marry. And he looked at my kids across the kitchen table when they were young, and he said to them, you know, you always think you're going to manage it your own way. It never works. He said, the most important thing in your life is to find that intimacy with God, and he will guide you, he will hold you, he will take you through safely in your journey as you walk hand in hand with him. When everything comes together, then you have wonder, then you have truth, then you have love, and you have security. That's what gives life meaning. And you'll find that only God is big enough to do that for you. God bless you, and thank you for listening to me.